I'm Pastor Tom, and welcome to the Sunday Sermon.
You got to move. You gotta move. You got to move. You got to move. You got to move, child. You got to move. Gotta move. 'Cause when the Lord gets ready.
I'm going to read to you now from the Gospel according to Luke. This is from the 24th chapter, the first 11 verses. Now on the first day of the week, early dawn, the women came to the tomb bringing the spices which they had prepared with which to anoint the body of Jesus. And they found that the stone had already been rolled away from the tomb entrance. And when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. So they were very perplexed about this, when suddenly 2 men stood near them in dazzling apparel. And the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. And the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Remember how he spoke to you while he was still in Galilee, saying that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." And they did remember that he said this. So they returned from the tomb, and they reported everything that happened to the 11 apostles and to all the rest. And the ones who were doing this, the women, they were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and some of the other women also. And they were explaining these things to the apostles, but it seemed to the apostles as if they were talking nonsense, and so they did not believe. The Roman Empire was very invested in something they called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, because, peace is good for business. Now, I know that people say, I was reading this once, people always talk about war is good for business, good for the economy. Turns out it's not. It's good for a couple of small sectors of the economy, but peace is actually better for the economy as a whole. So the Romans understood that, and so they had the peace of Rome, and the idea was that everything would run smoothly, everyone would be quiet, and there would be lots of commerce, and the rich would get even richer. That was the plan. And so the Romans were very swift about dealing with any time that there was a threat to the peace of Rome. Any kind of uprising, insurrection, anyone talking about seceding from the Roman Empire, anything like that, their solution to the problem was much killing. And we see this in Palestine. Pilate was known to do this stuff. There was a group of people gathered, and they were talking about a nation of Israel and restoring the kingdom. And sure enough, Pilate sent a bunch of troops in to kill him. When there'd be peaceful protests where they were talking about, get the Romans out of here and we want a kingdom again, he'd sneak his troops into the crowd dressed as commoners, and then suddenly they'd whip off their robes and start killing people. So he's a pretty brutal guy, and that's kind of the way the Romans operated. So Pilate is in that world, and he's more than happy to put down anything that looks like it might be even possibly a threat to the authority of Rome and the peace of Rome. So they had captured, there was in Palestine, there was actually so we call them the Zealots. The Romans called them the Sicari, which means the slashers, because they were known to assassinate people with knives. And I like to call them Al-Qaeda in Jerusalem, because they were basically a terrorist group. They wanted a nation of Israel completely free of Rome, and they were willing to kill anyone they needed to get there. And they'd been around by the time Jesus is in front of Pilate, they've been around for at least 20 years doing this stuff. So it's a tense time. Pilate, though, has in his prison 3 guys who are part of that movement, including one of the 3 is actually one of the ringleaders. His name is Barabbas. And when the religious leadership in Judea there brought Jesus, and they're telling Pilate that Jesus is this terrible threat. And they'd rather have Barabbas released than Jesus, because Jesus is the real danger to the peace. You know, Pilate takes some convincing, but once he's convinced, he's like, okay, you can have Barabbas and I'll kill this guy. Jesus, right? So you got Barabbas, who's actually a violent terrorist, and then you got Jesus, who's been preaching peace and love and mercy and proclaiming a kingdom of heaven. And actually, it says to Pilate, he says, you know, if my kingdom were of this earth, my followers would be fighting for me. But my kingdom is not of this world. And yet, rightly, they recognize that he was far greater threat to Rome and to the status quo anywhere than any violent insurrectionist. And so Pilate had him killed, had Jesus crucified. You've heard of the term cognitive dissonance. So this is where that term comes from. There was, I think it was in the 50s, there was a psychologist who was studying a UFO cult. Okay, so UFO cults, when they pop up, are pretty consistent. There's a leader who claims to have some kind of telepathic communication with the aliens, and that the aliens are coming, and that the aliens are going to rescue the faithful followers from whatever destruction is about to happen on the earth. I think the Heaven's Gate cult was maybe the most recent one of these that I remember. Everyone committed suicide, figuring that when they died, they would commit suicide, but their neural patterns would be picked up by the alien spacecraft and they would be like reconstituted in space or something, whatever the idea was. But so these are fairly consistent ideas. So back in the 50s, there's this cult, and the leader of the cult, she was in telepathic communication with the aliens, and they had a day. This is the day it's going to happen. The world's going to end on this day, but the aliens are going to save us. So they were all gathered together on that day, and it didn't happen. And so, you know, they're like, what's going on? And so some are depressed and some are angry, you know, feeling like maybe they got fooled, frustrated, what's happening. And so she goes into the other room to check in with the aliens. And she comes back with another telepathic message from the aliens. And the message is, because you guys, you faithful group, were so good and faithful, you are the reason that the earth was spared the destruction that was supposed to come. And so now your job is to continue to spread this message of love and peace and alien harmony or whatever through the world. So this kind of reinterpretation of events to make it so that you don't have to admit you were wrong is called cognitive dissonance. That's the term. That's the driver for this to happen. And so the psychologist who was studying them coins that term. So I'm mentioning this because Jesus is viewed as a Messiah. People are starting to get that. There's a very important story where Jesus asks his disciples, well, who are people saying that I am? And they go, well, some say you're one of the prophets, some say you're John the Baptist back from the dead, others say you're Elijah. And Jesus says, okay, well, now who do you say that I am? And Peter goes, wait, I think I know this one. You're the Messiah, Son of the living God. And Jesus high-fives him. Boom, well done, Peter. And that's the rock on which my church shall be built. So they're expecting Messiah. But then Jesus starts to tell them what that means. It actually says, and he began to explain to them how he would be handed over to the religious authorities and to the Romans, and that he would be crucified, but he's going to rise again on the third day. They didn't hear anything past crucified. They're like, that cannot happen. That is not going to happen. And so their brains are stuck because for them, Messiah is the king who's going to kick out the Romans and set up this kingdom on earth. And they're arguing about who gets to sit at Jesus' right hand, who's going to have the job of defense minister, who's going to be in charge of the treasury. They're working out the administration. That's the world that they're in. They're looking at this great, you know, we're going to run things. It's actually a good thing for them that they didn't. I don't know if you know this, but the Taliban, once they took over Afghanistan after the U.S. troops left, after however many years we were there, And the troops we'd been standing up for all of those years just like disappeared. The Taliban quickly found out that it sounds good when you're saying, we want our country, we want to be in charge, but it's really different when you actually have to run things. And they were like bored and frustrated because they had to get up and go to work, and do stuff. It wasn't glamorous anymore. So the disciples are probably lucky that it didn't go that way, because their lives got a lot more interesting as a result. When Jesus is crucified, in the Old Testament, there's a law that says, cursed is anyone who's hung from a tree. And so you can't be cursed of God and be God's chosen Messiah. So this action, this crucifixion, should undo any claim that had been made. And they're struggling with this. These poor people are struggling with what it means. What did this whole thing mean if this is how it ends? They were really having a hard time with this. And I think if enough time had gone by, they probably would have cognitive dissonance themselves into some kind of minor religious sect of Judaism that looked back to a rabbi named Jesus who, spoke of love and came in peace, and that's how the story ended. And then the women show up. Now the women, they seem to have a different agenda. I find this really interesting because the men are hung up on who's going to be the boss. The women they just thought they loved Jesus. They just loved Jesus. And so when he died, that's so horrible and heartbreaking. Their thought is like, not how do we explain this, or was I stupid for believing and following him? It was just like, what can we do to show how much we love him even though he's gone? So they prepared the spices to anoint the body. They just didn't have enough time to do it on Friday because Sabbath starts when the sun sets, and there just barely was enough time to get him off the cross, wrapped up in the cloth, stuck in the tomb. So they've come back after the Sabbath is over on the first day of the week, early in the morning, as soon as they can get there, in order to anoint the body and sort of complete the proper respectful burial practice. Only there's no body. And, okay. And then the angels show up. Now, Luke does not describe them as angels. He says 2 men with dazzling apparel. But from the women's reaction, we know they're angels, because pretty much every time angels show up, people are terrified. That's just consistent throughout the scriptures. Usually the first things that angels say is, do not be afraid. Like, don't be afraid. I got good news for you. So they're terrified. They're like, ow. And what the angels say, he's not here, he's risen, go tell the disciples. Remember, he told you this was going to happen? And they're like, he did. And of course, when they go to tell the disciples, these poor guys do not believe them. Now, I kind of get that. They are struggling. They were so hung up on the victory that they didn't get what kind of victory God was intending. They thought it was going to be a political victory. And that's where their heads were at. And so the women are saying, no, we got it wrong. This is something totally different going on here. And they're not ready for this information. They just can't process it yet. I kind of get that, because I understand that how we live our lives. We keep thinking there's something that's going to make it good for us, So you think, okay, I know what's going to make me happy. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to do well. I'm going to buy stuff. Right? And we start to get like, if I only had that ginormous 87,000-inch TV, then I'd finally be happy. If I finally finished the project to turn the basement into the entertainment center room, then I'd finally be happy. Or we're like, oh, that car. If I got that car, I'd finally be happy. Do you have like your dream car? I have 2. A classic Porsche 911 or a Tesla. Either one. I can go either way. But, if I finally have that, I'll finally be happy. And so we kind of go through life that way. We're like, what's gonna do it? If I can finally become popular, I'll finally be happy. Or my life will mean something if I accomplish, I reach a high status in my company or in my community, then I can finally be happy. Sometimes we figure out that doesn't work, and so we try a different method. If I can just numb the pain enough, I'll finally be happy. If I can find the right chemical, I'll finally be happy. If I can just score one more hit, just one more time, get that high that was the way it was that very first time, I'll finally be happy. If I could just hold on to that, finally it would be okay. We're always looking for that stuff. And that's some of what drives us to come to church. We come to church because we just, I want to be happy, so make me happy. Comfort me. Comfort me. Which is why, of course, you have all the great familiar hymns. It's because it just doesn't feel like Easter if we don't sing the hymns. By the way, it's the same with Christmas. You cannot end a Christmas Eve service without singing Silent Night, right? So, and it's got to be on the organ, right? I had an organist once, a true story. I had this organist, and she said, Pastor Tom, you know the story, right? How the organ was broken, so they wrote the song. Silent Night was written to be played on the guitar because there was no organ. I'm like, yeah. Well, could we do that? Like, do it on the guitar instead of the organ, like it was intended? I'm like, sure. So, we reminded people of the story, and we did Silent Night on the organ, and you should have heard the complaints later. It just didn't feel like Christmas Eve because we didn't sing it with the organ. So we come to church, and we're looking for something, we're hoping for something that's going to make us feel good and comfort us, and then we can just leave, right? This happens so often. Now, I love comfort, and I love the old hymns, and I love all of those things, but we come looking only for that. And if that's what it's about for us, then what the angels say is really appropriate. Why do we seek the living among the dead? Why? Because all of that stuff, whether it's wealth, fame, prosperity, success, comfort, religion, none of it can bring us life. It sometimes points the way, but it's not the life. And so there we are, wondering why it doesn't feel more important to us, wondering why. This is actually one of the lessons I think that COVID taught us, right? What happens at COVID? Suddenly we can't go to church, and then COVID ends, and we found out we didn't miss it. That's why we didn't see a whole bunch of people coming back to church after COVID, like, oh, thank the Lord, I finally get to gather with God's people and worship God again. It's because what we were experiencing wasn't really life. So we found out we could do without it. And the reason for that, I think, is because we haven't figured it out. The life that we are called to is not the life of ease and comfort, even though there are times of ease and comfort. It's a life of challenge and growth and pushing and moving and expanding and serving and loving and forgiving. It's a life of challenge and difficulty. It's a life that asks us to be more than we are now. And, if you hang around, if you were to keep coming back Sunday after Sunday as we go into the book of Acts, you would see that that's what the story is. The story is actually the story about how the church as a whole expands and grows and understands itself and moves out of its comfort zone, outside the box to the place where the magic happens, and stuff goes on, and they're constantly troubled and struggled with this. Or you might see the story of Paul. You don't know who the Apostle Paul is, right? Everyone's like, oh, the Apostle Paul, the Apostle Paul. Oh, you're going to find out in the book of Acts, you find out that the Apostle Paul was a jerk. First, he was a jerk who hated Christians and was against Jesus. And then he meets Jesus, and he becomes a jerk for Jesus. He was a complete jerk. I would use other words to describe him if I wasn't in church right now. Seriously. And it took about 15 years for this guy to become the guy who we think of, the guy who said, love is patient, love is kind, love is gentle, it does not keep records of wrongs. That Apostle Paul is a guy who happens because God kept working on him for years. That's what life is about. Real life is about changing, growing, being challenged, being pushed, being the person who tries something, and if it doesn't work, I'm thinking of Paul again. He's doing something and it's not working, and God says, okay, go over here and try it over there. And he goes, okay. Constantly being given an opportunity to be more, to do more, to be a part of something more. You know, before they're thinking, what is it worth killing people for? What is it worth ruling for? And now the question is, what is it worth giving my life for? What is it worth serving for? What is worth serving for? Because that's what life is about. That's what real life is. And that kind of life does not end. Ever. That's the gospel. That's what we tell. That's what we're saying. You grab hold of Jesus and you just keep going, and Jesus will shake you to the core, invite you to be a different, better person, not expected of you at any particular minute, but trust me, we'll just keep working on you. If you want to stay where you are, then don't hang around very long with Jesus. But if you want to live, if you want your life to not only be meaningful here, but forever, to be full of actual life, actual power, actual change and transformation, then grab on tight. And know that this is true for one really simple reason. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Can you find now the prayer of response? It's printed in the bulletin. Please stand. We're going to pray that together. I have invested myself in this world, in this dead and dying place, expecting it to bring me life. I have longed to lengthen my earthly existence as if length of days was a value all its own. I have sought to satisfy my soul with possessions and comforts, thinking ease was the same as peace. I have tried to strengthen my spirit with comforting religious routine and a familiar, undemanding faith, as though I could ever be truly satisfied with such empty, lifeless gestures. Why seek the living among the dead? Risen Christ, fill me with genuine living. Let me know the wild, turbulent, challenging, satisfying, unexpected, and joy-filled life which is mine in your name. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Amen. We'd love to have you join us for Sunday worship at 8:30 at the Christ United Methodist Church or 10:15 at the Stanton United Methodist Church. Until next time, may the Lord God bless you and keep you. May the face of the Almighty be upon you, and may God grant you peace.
When the Lord gets ready, you got to move. Oh, you got to